I think the findings this year were really interesting because actually what we saw is that compared to pre-COVID 2019, air connectivity in Europe has not recovered completely. We're still at 9% below where we were in air connectivity levels across Europe compared to 2019. So we're trailing actually passenger traffic growth, because in terms of passenger traffic and volumes, we are ahead, 5% ahead of 2019. Having said that, what we find is that the market is very differentiated. There is huge performance gaps between national markets in terms of air connectivity levels. And Cyprus is actually outperforming. It's amongst the three top fastest recovery from COVID in terms of air connectivity, along with, if I remember well, Greece and Portugal. So Cyprus is doing really well. Its air connectivity levels are actually, if I remember well, about 8% above 2019 levels. So it's a very good result for Cyprus. I think what we're seeing, what is shaping now a lot the performance of air connectivity is structural changes in the European aviation market, is the impact of geopolitics and the impact of aviation taxes that we have in some countries. So that explains why we have very huge performance gaps between markets. Well, clearly, if we look where we are today as the European aviation market, we're in a very different position compared to where we were pre-COVID. It's a very different market. The market has structurally changed, and there are several reasons for that. The first one is supply side pressures. So we know that airlines are facing a lot of problems in getting the delivery of the aircraft they have ordered on time. They also have huge issues in terms of the maintenance of the engines, and that limits the capacity that airlines are able to put in the market. So that's one big supply constraint. The second one is the lack of airport capacity in Europe. We have many airports in Europe that are reaching congestion level. Actually, Europe is home to half of the world's most congested airport. And that, of course, is also a supply constraint. And finally, we tend to have now a policy and regulatory regime as well in Europe that is not very conducive to having more air services. Then on the demand side, what we see is the demand is very different compared to how it was pre-COVID, in the sense that now the demand for air transport is mainly driven by leisure and people who travel to visit friends and relatives. The people who travel for business, it's still very much down compared to where it was pre-COVID, about 20 to 25% down. So that's a major structural change. We see also that the demand is much more international than domestic. We have major slump in domestic traffic in the big European markets like France and Germany. And finally, the third factor, so supply constraint, changed in demand. The third factor is that the main drivers of growth from an airline perspective in the European aviation market are the low-cost carriers. The low-cost carriers have put a lot more capacity in the market following the recovery from COVID. They've actually used the COVID pandemic as an opportunity to gain market share, because the full-service carriers, the network carriers, have retrenched on their hubs and they are not driving capacity at the moment. So, to give you a few figures, we see that low-cost carriers have increased their air connectivity levels by 19% compared to pre-pandemic levels, whereas the network carriers, the full-service carriers, have their connectivity level which is negative, minus 15% compared to pre-pandemic. So major structural changes in the market. Well, the impact is massive, because clearly airports are engines of economic growth and they are actually job machines. If you look at European levels, airports account for 5% or support 5% of GDP in Europe. That means that their economic value is about 850 billion euro. That's really a massive growth driver. And in terms of jobs also, it's a massive job contribution across Europe, 16 million of jobs facilitated by Europe's airport. And that's down to a few simple things. The fact that, when you ask companies what are the top criteria for them to select where they're going to establish their facilities, the proximity to an airport and the quality of air connectivity always comes on top, together with a few other factors. So airports are really essential to drive inward investment, economic diversification, and of course tourism, clearly. Does this receive enough attention in Europe? I don't think so. I think we've lost in Europe policy support for airport development and in general for aviation. I think those economic benefits that I've described I've mainly taken for granted. And what we've seen developing over the past 10-15 years is rather a punitive approach in terms of policy making for aviation, which we need to rebalance and to redress. Especially now, because we see that finally the EU is moving towards addressing its huge competitive gaps vis-à-vis our other trading partners. And what we see is that outside Europe, governments are putting airports and air connectivity at the very core of their economic development strategy. And that's something we completely lost in Europe and that we need to go back to. Well, I think, when you look at airfares, actually airport capacity is a driver for more competitive airfares. Why? Because what we see is that at congested airports, when there is no more room to accommodate new airlines, you have less airline competition, which translates into more pricing power for airlines, which means that the airfares are higher. And as I mentioned earlier, Europe is home to half of the world's most congested airports, and that's a key driver for higher airfares. So developing airport capacity is actually a way to ensure that we have a competitive aviation market, which in turn translates into more affordable airfares. I think down the road, what really drives airfares, it's the level of demand, of course, on any market. If you have more demand and more volumes, the airfare will tend to be lower. But it's also the competitive position of airlines on any air route. So where you have only one airline operating a route, generally the airfares are higher. When you have several airlines operating the same route, of course there is competition and that drives airfare down. And this is why airport capacity is actually fundamental for having affordable airfares. Well, I think I mentioned those factors earlier. Clearly, they act as major supply constraints and they limit the growth. They also result in more pricing power to the airlines, which explains why airfares in Europe are quite high or have increased quite a lot. On average, if we look at airfares globally, the increase is about 5% this year. But if we look at Europe, the increase is more than double that rate at 11%. And even more interestingly, if we look in Europe at only intra-European routes, the increase is at 22%. So we're seeing a very significant inflation of airfares, in part because of these supply constraints, also because we have a set of new regulatory measures coming from the EU, which tends to drive more cost onto the airlines, which of course translates into airfares. I think the main challenge for airports and for airports in Cyprus is of course how to attract and retain traffic and how to develop connectivity. I think in that context it's very important to reflect about the fact that market conditions have fundamentally changed for airports over the past 20-30 years because in part of the consolidation of the airline industry. Today you have 5 major airlines or airlines groups that control 60% of the market. And those airlines have become also much more flexible in where they allocate their aircraft and which route they decide to fly. So clearly, if they're not satisfied with a route, they're not going to wait months before they close it. They close it and they move the aircraft to other locations. The low-cost airlines in particular have extreme flexibility in doing that. And that means that those five airline groups that control 60% of the market, they have at their disposal more than 700 airports across Europe to choose from. So really what they do is they run beauty contests between those airports. I mean, we've seen letters sent by airlines to 70, 80 airports telling them, I have 5 new aircraft coming into line for the next season. I'm going to decide where I allocate those aircraft based on what you're offering me in terms of service quality, operational efficiency, and the level of airport charges that I'm going to have to pay. So it's a beauty context, and the competition is extreme. I'd like to come back to what I mentioned earlier, the fact that we need to make sure that the focus of EU policy for aviation is not only about sustainability and decarbonization. Of course, that remains crucial. We need as a sector to be able to achieve net zero emissions by 2050 to be aligned with the EU climate goals and address our climate impact, and we're working on to that. But we also need to balance that with adequate support for the aviation sector and make sure that the role of aviation and air connectivity for the competitiveness of Europe is being recognized and supported, because that's no longer the case. So when it comes in particular to decarbonization, we now have a set of rules in Europe that are framing the decarbonization of the aviation sector. That includes the inclusion of aviation into the EU emission trading scheme. That includes also clear mandates for the deployment of sustainable aviation fuels. And this is all very good, but we need more financial support and more regulatory support with those regulations to achieve those climate goals. Because the cost of decarbonization for the aviation sector is massive. We're talking about 1.3 trillion euro of additional cost to decarbonize the sector by 2050. And clearly no sector can bear that kind of cost alone. So we need more financial support, and there are some encouraging developments. Since a few weeks now in Europe, there is now a sustainable transport investment plan proposed by the Commission to facilitate, in particular, the development of sustainable aviation fuels and to reduce the price gap that we have with conventional fuels. But we need more financial and regulatory support. So that's a key ask for us to the Cypriot EU Presidency, to make sure that we get more financial regulatory support at EU level, and to make sure that in policy terms, aviation is really repositioned, not only with the sustainability agenda of the EU, but also with the competitiveness and strategic autonomy agenda. We have also many other files that we're going to discuss with the EU Presidency, the Cyprus EU Presidency, the need, for example, to reform the 30-year-old rules on airport slot allocation, the need to make sure that we continue to have a liberal open skies approach on aviation, and so on. I can go for quite some time. But we're very excited by the prospect of having Cyprus taken the EU presidency, because of course Cyprus depends really on air connectivity given its geographical position. And we're looking to support in particular the aviation summit that the Cyprus presidency will be organizing here in Cyprus at EU level in June. Our top challenge remains sustainability and decarbonization because of the massive cost it involves. So that's our number one challenge. And it's really linked to our license to keep operating and to grow. I mean, if we fail in decarbonizing, we will fail for society, we will fail for our citizens, we will fail for the climate, and this will have very negative economic consequences, not just on us. So that's the number one challenge. The second challenge is, I think, capacity and resilience. As I mentioned, Europe is home to half of the world's most congested airports. So we need to be able to develop airport capacity, and that is becoming more and more difficult in Europe because there's a lot of pushback from communities and also at political level against developing airport capacity. And I think in doing that, our societies are really ignoring the key role that airports play for economic development and in particular for tourism. So that's very important. And then we have the aspect of resilience. Resilience for our facilities, our infrastructure, because of new threats, in particular linked to security, to cyber security. Resilience also in terms of climate impacts, because as the climate changes, this will impact our infrastructure as well. So I would say those are the major challenge we see, together with the need to maintain a very liberal approach on allowing airlines to operate into Europe and from Europe to external markets. So we still have many markets between the EU and third countries that are very much regulated and restricted in terms of the ability of airlines to operate. And I think we need a much more liberal open sky approach in that, for that, which of course is challenging at the moment because we see the world geopolitically is fragmenting, and there is a big risk that this could lead to more restrictions to air services down the line. Well, I think airport concessions have been almost the predominant model if we look at the past 30 years, in the sense that states across Europe have realized that it's not necessarily part of their core responsibility to manage and finance airport developments. We see national budgets being squeezed a lot, which means that states prefer to spend their money on other priorities than developing airport infrastructure. And that's why we've seen the concession model and privatization really developing a lot in Europe over this past 30 years. I think these models are very interesting because indeed they allow governments to turn what used to be very often a loss-making operation into a revenue generation for the state. Because if I give the example of the concession in Cyprus, since this concession was established in Cyprus, the private operator has given, I think, more than 650 million euro in concession fees to the state. I mean, 1/3 of the revenues of Hermes every year goes to the state. So that's, I think that's a very good deal for the state. And also it allows airports, as I said, not to spend money on developing airport infrastructure, because these are airports are very capital-intensive business. They require, of course, a lot of investment, not only in developing capacity, but also in maintaining and modernizing existing facilities. So I think it's been a win-win. And what we've seen across Europe actually is that the entry of private operators has allowed to bring more know-how, more commercial expertise, and more financing into the airport sector. And I think if you look at the quality of airport infrastructure today in Europe compared to other parts of the world, and I'm thinking in particular with North America, where the airport system remains mainly in public hands, you can see a vast difference in the quality of service and the quality of the infrastructure. So, I think that's a model that's here to stay. I don't see states going backwards and going back 30 years and taking over airports. I think they have other priorities. I think their citizens want them to spend the money elsewhere when it comes to public money. And I think the private operators have proven that they're doing a very good job in developing airport infrastructure. Well, Hermes has been from the start of its operation a member of ACI. It's a very active member. They're very involved in our network of committees, working group, fora. So they feed us a lot, and they receive a lot from us in terms of also know-how, sharing expertise, benchmarking. The CEO of Hermes has been member of our board for many years. She's also very, very active with us. So we have an excellent cooperation with Hermes. And I think here too, it's a win-win relationship. and we look forward to continue that win-win relationship with Hermes, and of course working closely with the government here in Cyprus.